In this episode of Weekly Poker Hand, let's take a look at a wild hand that Owen played, one of my favorite poker video bloggers. Let's get right to it.
I head to the next table where we've got 5-4 suited in the big blind as soon as I sit down. Player in middle position limps in with a short stack, the cutoff raises to 25. The button calls, I call for 20 more, the middle position player calls as well, we're going 4 ways to the flop out of position, it comes 4-4 deuce rainbow.
Slow down, Brad. This is a spot where very multi-way, you actually have to be a little bit careful with the low suited connected hands, especially from out of position. That said, in a loose, splashy cash game, it's definitely fine to call from the small blind. But as the raise size gets bigger and bigger, and as it gets more and more multi-way to the point that you're going to be making the bottom end of the straight and running into bigger straights, or bad flushes and running into bigger flushes, these hands may potentially become folds pre-flop, especially from the small blind. Flop comes 4-4-2. $100 in the pot. Here we go.
We've got trips immediately at this new location. Unfortunately, everyone checks. The turn's the 3 of diamonds, giving us an open-ended straight draw to go along with our 3 fours.
This is a spot where some people continue slow playing because they think, all right, well, if I bet, they're just all going to fold. But no. With 3 of a kind at this point, people will call with an ace, with a 5, with any sort of pair. So we need to bet and get money in the pot.
Can't allow this to check through again. I bet 75 for value.
That's a chunky bet into the $100 pot. Typically when you should have a whole lot of super nuts in your range, and on top of that, your opponent's ranges should all be very trashy, which is probably the case when it checks through on the 4-4-2 board. You could usually go for a slightly smaller bet. However, in live cash games, you should be highly inclined just to bet on the larger side, because if your opponents have anything, they're just not going to fold. And if they fold, they can't make it on the video blog. So blast them, just like Brad does.
The middle position player is contemplating what to do. It's a little scary for us because he only limp called the raise pre-flop. A lot of people tend to take this line with small pocket pairs or small suited connecting hands, so on a paired board with all low cards, it's very possible that this opponent could already have a full house or a straight. He calls. It's also possible that he just has something like pocket fives or maybe a diamond flush draw. The initial pre-flop raiser calls in the cutoff. The button calls as well. After no one showed interest on the flop, all 3 of our opponents are willing to call a larger size turn bet.
That is excellent. Typically when you bet big on the turn in a spot where you could have lots of nuts and your opponents can't really, I mean, they must have something decent, right? Are we looking at a bunch of straights, overpairs, etc.? Kind of surprised some of those didn't bet the flop. But whatever, good. This is the kind of action you'll get in loose, splashy games.
It may not be best. The river is the 4 of diamonds, giving us quad 4s in an incredible spot.
Interesting scenario. How much should Brad bet here? Pot's $400. I would go on the big side. I mean, essentially you're saying, I like my hand, but at the same time, your opponents all called the turn, so they're going to have flush draws, which while they got there, a flush is not good on a trips board, and they're going to have pairs and busted straight draws. So busted straight draws are always going to fold. I got to presume the flushes are always going to fold to any decently big bet, and full houses are always going to call. So pot's 400. I would just go big, like pot, maybe even more than pot. I will say that at the smaller stakes games, I think they're playing 2-5 here, which is, medium enough. But at the smaller stakes games, I found that when you start really pulling out big bets, like over bets, people will start to make pretty tight folds. But if you pot it, they'll just call with all sorts of stuff. So I think I'd prefer a pot size bet of roughly 400 in this scenario. But in a higher stakes games, I would be very polarized in this scenario to pretty much quads and nothing, or straight flushes. I would probably bet even bigger, like 800 or 1,000. Like just really try to get called by their full houses.
I bet 400, which will probably look like a wild bluff because our line is kind of ridiculous.
Brad does go pot. Nice.
We didn't 3-bet pre-flop, so we'll rarely have pocket pairs like 10s or better. We bet on the turn, indicating that we had a straight, a small full house, or trip 4s. With a third 4 out there, our hands like pocket 3s and pocket deuces get counterfeited, and a straight is more worthless than an NFT collection.
Not my NFT collection.
The big bet looks like I've got exactly quads or complete air. The middle position player only has 225 in his stack. He's getting over 40% off the retail price. That's a bargain that he can't turn down. He calls, the cutoff folds quickly. The action's on the button. He only has 335, so he'd be getting a discount as well. The button saw the middle position player struggling to decide whether or not to call, so maybe the middle position opponent doesn't have much, and it's pretty unlikely that I'm going to river quads. It's very possible the button talks himself into looking us up.
So let's talk about this concept right here, because this is important. On the river, in a multi-way pot, Bestbet, the first player, thought for a while and then struggled to call. Now, presuming this is not them just Hollywooding, it means they probably had a pretty close spot. So what's a close spot on this board? Probably a bad full house, maybe a flush, something like that. So given they struggled to call, say it gets around to you in your last act, and you know the player in the middle struggled to call, and you know they're not Hollywooding or trying to trick you. Well, now you should be more inclined to call if you have a hand that would have normally called. Because, like, say you have a decent full house, like pocket tens or something like that. That's a hand that would automatically call the 400 normally. Now there's just $400 more dollars in the pot that you almost always beat, right? So this should make you more inclined to call. However, if Brad bet 400 and then the first player just like snap calls, well, what do you think they have, right? They probably have something very, very good. And a hand like pocket tens is going to be way worse in that scenario. Now, I realize that the snap caller having fours is somewhat unlikely, but maybe they slow played aces on the flop or something like that. That's certainly reasonable. And that'll become even more true if you have a hand like pocket sevens or something like that, because maybe they just snap called it off with nines, right? So this is a situation where when you are in the middle, where Brad bets and then you have to act before people yet to act, you really want to be very stoic, because that will perhaps completely crush you in situations like this. And to be fair, if you did have a medium strength hand, like, I don't know, pocket sixes that you knew you wanted to call with, and you knew you were going to call, you should just like snap call, like put it in there, no problem. And then if somebody yet to act is sitting there with a hand like pocket tens, they're going to be far more inclined to fold compared to if you sat there and you're like, oh, what should I do? What should I do? All right, okay, I guess I call. And then you call, then the tens is going to call every time and you're just going to lose.
Well, I came to play. I call.
Calls quads.
Two callers.
Nice.
We get called by the middle position player's 6-5 of hearts, which was a turn straight. I've got some NFTs to sell that guy. And then we also get called by the button's pocket eights in a three-way all-in while we've got the nuts. I don't think that I've ever stacked multiple players with quads before. To the button's credit, he takes the loss better than anyone I've ever seen.
You come to Savannah, dinner's on me.
Oh, nice, man.
Wow.
So 400, call by a straight. That is not a good call on a flush end paired board. And then the other guy with pocket eights, funny enough, he had exactly the spot I was talking about, where, because he's now getting way better odds, pocket eights becomes a very reasonable call. Whereas if the player with a straight, well, you know, obviously they should have folded, but if they just snap call, pocket eights probably becomes a fold. So very cool to see that in action. The one of the players, I think the player who lost, threw him a card for a free dinner for two. Don't forge that. That would not be kind. What I want to know before we pack it up today is if you were sitting at the poker table, who would you be the most excited to play against, to the point that you're going to invite them over to your restaurant to have dinner if they're ever in the same town? Take a second, let me know. Write it in the comments section below. And if they're a poker video blogger, maybe we'll try to see if they will let us use some of their hands to review on this channel, just like Brad does. So huge thanks to Brad for letting us use this footage. Good luck in your games. Have fun. And if you get quads, I hope you stack multiple people at once.